My parents, Lori and Jack, didn't exactly have me in their life plans. They were the classic power couple, always focused on their careers and the business they built together. I was just an unplanned addition to their story, a surprise they had to figure out along the way. They weren't cruel or anything, but it was clear early on that parenting wasn't their priority. Their work always came first. Growing up, I spent most of my time with teachers, babysitters, or in front of the TV. I became an expert at entertaining myself because they were rarely around. I'd watch cartoons, play with whatever toys I had, or just daydream about what it might be like to have the kind of parents who actually sat down and played with their kid. I wasn't neglected in the traditional sense. I always had food, clothes, and a roof over my head, but emotionally, I felt pretty alone. Holidays and birthdays were particularly strange. For most people, those are times to spend with family, but for me, it was just transactional. Every Christmas or birthday, instead of celebrating together, my parents would hand me a couple $100, usually around $200, and tell me to buy whatever I wanted. I mean, sure, getting money as a kid sounds awesome, and at the time I thought it was. But as I got older, I realized it was just their way of avoiding having to spend time with me. No cake, no special moments, just a quick, happy birthday. Here's some cash, before they went back to their work. Looking back, I don't think they meant to hurt me. They probably thought they were doing their best by providing for me financially. And sure, I had the latest gadgets or cool clothes, but I would have traded all of it for a little bit of their time. A family dinner, a movie night, or even just sitting down to talk. It would have meant so much more than another $200 in my pocket. It's weird to think about how much those early years shaped me. I learned to be independent pretty quickly, but I also learned to keep people at arm's length. I think deep down, I figured if my own parents couldn't make time for me, why would anyone else? I guess it's no surprise that relationships have always been a little tricky for me, but I'll get into that later. For now, I just wanted to share this part of my story because it's been weighing on me lately. After I graduated high school, my life took a turn I wasn't really prepared for, even though I should have seen it coming. About a week after the graduation ceremony, my parents handed me an envelope. At first, I thought it was some kind of graduation gift, a check or maybe a card with a heartfelt note. Turns out, it was a notice that I had 1 month to move out. That was it. No discussion, no warning. Just a polite but firm reminder that their financial responsibility to me was over. I was 19 at the time and working a part-time job at a coffee shop, making just enough to scrape by. I'd managed to save a little, but not nearly enough to cover rent in my city, where even the cheapest apartments started at $1,800 a month. My parents didn't offer any help or advice. They just assumed I'd figure it out like I always had. It felt like they were saying, "We've done our part. Now you're on your own." I spent that month frantically trying to find a solution. I looked for cheaper places, asked around for roommates, even considered moving in with a friend from work, but nothing panned out. My savings wouldn't stretch far enough, and I didn't have a safety net. By the time the deadline rolled around, I was out of options. My parents didn't even say goodbye when I left. They were busy with some business trip, so I just packed up my stuff and walked out the door. For a while, I crashed on a friend's couch, but it was clear that wasn't a long-term solution. Eventually, I ended up moving to a neighboring city where the cost of living was slightly lower. Even then, I couldn't afford rent. So I bought a cheap tent from a thrift store and set up camp in a small wooded area near the edge of town. That tent became my home. Living out there was humbling, to say the least. I'd wake up to the sound of birds instead of an alarm clock, which sounds nice until you realize it's because you don't have a roof over your head. I showered at a local gym where I'd managed to get a discounted membership, and I kept my part-time job, though I had to lie about where I was living. I'd tell my coworkers I was staying with a friend because I couldn't handle the pity or the questions if they knew the truth. Some nights were scary. The first time it rained, I found out my tent wasn't as waterproof as I thought, and everything I owned got soaked. There were also people, other homeless folks or just random passers-by, who would stumble into my little camp. Most of the time they were harmless, but I always kept a knife nearby just in case. Looking back, I don't know how I made it through those months. I learned to live on almost nothing, to stretch every dollar and every meal. But more than that, I learned how invisible you become when you don't have an address. People don't see you the same way. You're not part of their world anymore. That experience changed me. It hardened me, made me more self-reliant, but it also left scars I'm still dealing with. I told myself I'd never let anyone put me in that position again, that I'd always have a backup plan, no matter what. But sometimes, I can't help wondering if my parents ever thought about me during that time. Did they even care where I ended up? Or was I just another thing they checked off their to-do list? I'll never forget the day Molly, my neighbor from the coffee shop, changed my life. She was one of those people who paid attention to things others overlooked. I guess she noticed that I always seemed tired, that I wore the same clothes a lot, and that I never talked much about home. One day, during a slow shift, she pulled me aside and gently asked if everything was okay. It wasn't, obviously, but I wasn't used to sharing my problems. Still, something about her felt safe, so I opened up, about my parents, about the tent, about everything. Molly listened, and when I was done, she said, "What about your grandparents? Could they help?" I was stunned. I barely knew anything about them. My dad had always kept them at arm's length, and they weren't really a part of my life growing up. I vaguely remembered meeting them at a few holiday gatherings when I was really young, but that was it. I didn't even know if they were still alive, much less how to reach them. Molly, being Molly, said she'd help me figure it out. With a bit of digging and a lot of phone calls, Molly found a number for my dad's parents, Henry and Sandra. I didn't know what to expect when I called them, but their reaction floored me. The second I explained who I was and what was going on, they jumped into action. Within a week, they had sent me money for a plane ticket to Orlando and insisted I come stay with them. It was the first time in years that I felt like someone truly cared about me. When I arrived, I was nervous. I hadn't seen Henry and Sandra in so long, and I didn't know what they'd think of me. But the moment they saw me, Sandra pulled me into a hug, and Henry clapped me on the shoulder with a big grin. They welcomed me into their home like I'd always belonged there. Their house was cozy, filled with warmth and pictures of family I barely recognized. It was a world away from the cold, businesslike atmosphere I'd grown up in. Over the next few weeks, they helped me get back on my feet. They insisted I enroll in college, and they covered all the costs, tuition, books, everything. I didn't know how to thank them, but they just brushed it off, saying it was what family was supposed to do. For the first time in my life, I felt supported, like I wasn't carrying the weight of the world on my own. And then they did something I'll never forget. One evening, Henry sat me down at the kitchen table and handed me a stack of papers. It was the deed to their house. They told me they wanted to sell it to me for $50,000. I was stunned. The house was easily worth over $150,000, but they said they didn't care about the market value. They wanted to make sure I had a place to call my own, something secure that no one could take away from me. I didn't have the money, of course, but they worked out a payment plan that was so generous it felt like a gift. They weren't just giving me a house. They were giving me stability, something I'd never really had before. Living with them was a healing experience in so many ways. I got to know them as people. Henry with his endless supply of jokes and Sandra with her quiet wisdom. They told me stories about my dad, too, about how he'd been distant even as a teenager, always chasing success at the expense of everything else. It didn't excuse how he treated me, but it helped me understand him a little better. Those years with my grandparents were some of the best of my life. They gave me more than a home and an education. They gave me a second chance. I'll never forget what they did for me, and I'll always be grateful that Molly cared enough to push me in the right direction. Without her, I don't know where I'd be. It had been 12 years since my parents kicked me out, and in that time, I had built a life I was proud of. With the help of my grandparents, I'd graduated college, started a decent career, and fully paid off the house they had so generously sold to me. I was finally in a place where I felt secure and independent. My parents? I hadn't heard from them since the day I walked out of their house. Honestly, I preferred it that way. Then, out of nowhere, everything came crashing down. I was away on a business trip when it all started. I'd been gone for a little over a week, staying in another state for some training sessions. One morning, I got a call from my neighbor, Jim, who sounded nervous. "Hey, Alex," he said hesitantly. "I don't mean to stick my nose in your business, but are your parents staying at your place?" I've seen them coming and going, and it looks like they've moved in. I nearly dropped my phone. My parents? At my house? It didn't make any sense. I hadn't spoken to them in over a decade, and there was no way they could have gotten in legally. I told Jim I'd look into it and immediately called the police to report an illegal entry. The next day, I cut my trip short and flew home, bracing myself for whatever mess awaited me. When I pulled up to my house, I couldn't believe my eyes. Their car was in my driveway. My parents, Lori and Jack, were in my house, sitting on my couch, like they belonged there. The second I walked through the door, my mom started acting like nothing was wrong. "Oh, Alex, it's so good to see you," she said with a forced smile, as if this was some kind of family reunion. I didn't even respond. I just asked, "What the hell are you doing here?" That's when my dad chimed in with his usual condescending tone. "We've fallen on hard times, Alex. The business went under and we lost everything. We had nowhere else to go." I stood there, stunned, trying to process what I was hearing. "So, you just broke into my house?" I asked, my voice rising. My mom waved me off like I was being unreasonable. "We didn't break in. We used the spare key. Besides, we're family. You wouldn't just let your parents be homeless, would you?" I was furious. I told them to leave immediately, but they refused. My dad smirked and said, "Actually, we're staying. We've already spoken to a lawyer, and we have a legal right to be here. You wouldn't want to get into a nasty court battle with your own parents, would you?" It turned out they were exploiting some obscure legal loophole. They claimed that we had an oral agreement, allowing them to stay in the house. Of course, it was complete bullshit, but proving that in court would take time. The pandemic had slowed down the legal system, and my lawyer warned me it could take months to evict them. So, for 7 long months, I had to deal with the nightmare of my parents living in my home. They refused to pay rent or contribute to bills, and they treated the place like they owned it. My dad took over my office, saying he needed it to plan his next venture. And my mom rearranged the living room because she thought it looked too plain. They even invited their friends over for dinners, acting like it was their house. The whole time, I couldn't help but think about how different this would have been if the roles were reversed. If I'd shown up at their door after being kicked out, they wouldn't have let me step foot inside. But now that they needed something, they were suddenly playing the family card. The legal process was agonizingly slow. Every time we seemed close to a resolution, there was another delay. Paperwork issues, scheduling conflicts, and, of course, the backlog caused by the pandemic. Meanwhile, I had to live with the people who had abandoned me, the same people who had turned their backs on me when I was at my lowest. Eventually, after 7 excruciating months, the court ruled in my favor. My parents were ordered to vacate the property immediately. They tried to appeal, but it didn't go anywhere. On the day they finally left, they acted like I was the bad guy. My mom called me selfish and ungrateful, and my dad muttered something about how I was just like everyone else who had let them down. I didn't even respond. I just stood on the porch and watched as they packed up their car and drove away. When they were gone, I walked back into my house, locked the door, and let out a long, shaky breath. It was finally over. That experience left me with even more questions about my parents than I started with. Did they ever actually care about me? Or was I just a convenience when it suited them? I don't know if I'll ever get an answer, but at this point, I'm not sure it matters. What I do know is that I'll never let them take advantage of me again. When the court finally handed down its decision, I felt a weight lift off my chest. The judge ruled in my favor, giving my parents 45 days to vacate my house. While it wasn't the immediate resolution I'd hoped for, it was still a win. I could finally see an end to this nightmare. During those 45 days, things got tense. My parents made no effort to hide their bitterness. My mom would sigh dramatically whenever I walked into the room, muttering things like, "This is how family treats each other these days," while my dad constantly complained about how ungrateful I was. They even tried to guilt-trip me by saying they were too old to start over and that I was dooming them to poverty. I didn't respond to most of it. I'd spent years carrying guilt they'd planted in me, and I wasn't about to fall into that trap again. I kept my distance as much as I could, staying late at work or holing up in my room when I was home. Every day felt like walking on eggshells. They'd invite their friends over, probably as a way to prove they were still in control, and leave me to clean up after their little gatherings. It was infuriating, but I knew the clock was ticking, and I just had to hold out a little longer. When the deadline finally arrived, my parents packed up their things and moved out. They didn't leave quietly, of course. My dad made a snide comment about how I'd regret this someday, and my mom stood in the doorway, teary-eyed, trying one last time to guilt me. "We're your parents, Alex. No matter what, we'll always be family," she said, her voice dripping with self-pity. I didn't bother responding. I just watched as they loaded the last of their things into their car and drove away. I found out later that they'd rented a small studio apartment in a neighboring city. The rent was $950 a month, and from what I heard, the place was in rough shape. Dull, stained walls, a filthy carpet that probably hadn't been cleaned in years, and a single window that looked out onto the blank brick wall of the building next door. It was a far cry from the comfort they'd known in their old lives, but it was what they could afford after losing everything. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for them, but I couldn't. This was the same couple who'd thrown me out with no warning, who hadn't cared where I ended up or how I survived. Now they were facing the kind of struggle they'd forced me into all those years ago, and while I wouldn't wish that on anyone, I couldn't muster much sympathy for them either. I'd heard through the grapevine that they were blaming everyone but themselves for their situation, the economy, bad luck, even me. They couldn't seem to accept that their downfall was a direct result of their own decisions. It was classic Lori and Jack, always pointing fingers instead of taking responsibility. After they left, my house felt different. For months, it had been a battleground, a constant reminder of their intrusion into my life. Now it was quiet, peaceful. I walked through each room, taking in the silence, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly at home. I didn't have to look over my shoulder or brace myself for passive-aggressive comments. The space was mine again, and it felt like a fresh start. The whole ordeal had left me drained, but it also taught me something important. I didn't owe my parents anything. They'd made their choices, and I'd made mine. They'd tried to take advantage of me, to manipulate me into taking care of them after they'd abandoned me. But I hadn't let them. I'd stood my ground, and in the end, I'd won. As for my parents, I don't know what their future holds. Maybe they'll find a way to rebuild their lives, or maybe they'll keep blaming everyone else for their problems. Either way, I know one thing for sure. Their choices are no longer my responsibility. With everything behind me, I've finally been able to focus on what's next. The house, as much as I loved it, feels tied to too many bad memories now. It was a safe haven for so many years, but after everything with my parents, it doesn't feel the same anymore. So, I decided it was time to move on. Literally. The market in my area has skyrocketed over the past few years, and the house is now worth around $250,000. It's a bittersweet decision to sell, but I know it's the right one. The plan is to move to Arizona, where my grandparents relocated a couple of years ago. They're getting older, and I want to be closer to them. After everything they've done for me, it feels like the least I can do. Plus, Arizona's quieter pace and warm weather sound like exactly what I need. As for my parents, they've managed to bounce back financially. I heard through a family friend that Lori's mother passed away and left her a decent inheritance. Apparently, it was enough for them to open a new business, though I have no idea what kind. It's almost ironic, really. They hit rock bottom, moved into a rundown studio, and now they're back on their feet. Good for them, I guess. But even with their new success, our relationship is still completely broken. We haven't spoken since the day they left my house. No calls, no texts, nothing. And honestly, I'm okay with that. They've shown me time and again who they are, and I've finally learned to believe them. I spent so many years craving their approval, hoping they'd come around and see me as more than just an afterthought. But now, I've accepted that it's never going to happen, and I've stopped trying to force something that isn't there. Life feels lighter now. I'm wrapping up the sale of the house and looking forward to starting fresh in Arizona. My grandparents are thrilled about the idea of having me close by, and I'm excited to spend more time with them. They've been my rock through everything, and I want to make the most of whatever time we have left together. Sometimes, I think about how different things could have been if my parents had made even the slightest effort to be there for me. If they'd shown me half the love and support that Henry and Sandra have, maybe things wouldn't have turned out this way. But dwelling on that doesn't help. I can't change the past, but I can shape my future, and that's exactly what I'm doing. I don't know if I'll ever hear from Lori and Jack again. Part of me doubts it. They're too proud to admit they were wrong. But if they do, it'll be on my terms. I won't let them manipulate me or take advantage of me ever again. They had their chance to be my family, and they blew it. Now, I'm moving forward, and for the first time in a long time, it feels like the weight of their influence is finally gone. Arizona feels like a new chapter, one where I can focus on the people who truly matter and the life I want to build. I'm done looking back. It's time to move on. After everything I've been through, one thing is clear. I will never repeat the mistakes my parents made. I've spent a lot of time reflecting on how their choices shaped my life, and while I can't change the past, I can make sure it doesn't define my future. If I ever have kids, they'll never have to question if they're loved or if they matter. They'll never feel like an afterthought. My parents taught me a lot, just not in the way parents are supposed to. Their absence, both physically and emotionally, showed me exactly what not to do. They prioritized their careers and ambitions over me, and when things got tough, they pushed me out of their lives without a second thought. I know what it feels like to grow up without real support, and I wouldn't wish that on anyone, let alone my own children. I've decided that when I build a family, it'll be one rooted in trust, communication, and unconditional love. I want my kids to know they can come to me with anything, that I'll always be there for them no matter what. I want to be present in their lives, not just as someone who provides, but as someone who listens, who laughs with them, and who shares in their joys and struggles. That doesn't mean I'll be perfect. I know I'll make mistakes, everyone does, but the difference is that I'll own them. I'll apologize when I'm wrong, and I'll work to fix things instead of brushing them under the rug. My parents were so caught up in their own egos that they never admitted their faults, and it destroyed our relationship. I won't let that happen with my family. In a strange way, I guess I can thank my parents for teaching me these lessons. Their failures gave me a blueprint for the kind of parent I don't want to be. And while I wish things had been different, I know I can use those experiences to do better. It's not just about parenting, though. It's about all the relationships in my life. I want to build connections that are genuine and meaningful, whether it's with friends, a partner, or future kids. I want the people in my life to know they're valued, that they can count on me. It's a work in progress, but I'm committed to breaking the cycle of neglect and selfishness that I grew up in. I've come a long way since those days of living in a tent, feeling like I was completely alone in the world. My grandparents showed me what real love and support look like, and I want to carry that forward. Their kindness and generosity gave me a second chance, and I'm determined to make the most of it. Life hasn't been easy, but I'm proud of where I've ended up. I've learned to let go of the resentment and focus on building a future that's filled with love and connection. My parents may have shaped my early years, but they don't get to define the rest of my life. That's up to me now.